Hey guys, in this video I'm gonna be talking about my Widowhail Toxic Rain Pathfinder. This build is a variation on the usual gem level stacking version that aims to raise the level of Caustic Arrow or Toxic Rain as high as possible, and instead uses items like Widowhail and the Adorn to scale the modifiers on other items used within the build. It features a life pool that scales well over 7,000 and has the damage, clear speed, and tankiness needed for a build to safely reach level 100. In this video, I'll give an outline of what the endgame setup looks like and also provide a series of medium budget and early game setups. So let's get started. So the way this build works is that you'll have a Toxic Rain setup which fires projectiles into the air that land on top of enemies for some chaos damage and leave behind spore pods for a set duration. While these spore pods are on the ground, they deal chaos damage over time to nearby enemies, and this damage over time effect can stack the more pods you shoot into the area. The stacking damage over time effect from Toxic Rain will serve as the basis for this build's single target damage. Now, in order to clear large areas filled with monsters, Caustic Arrow will be used to achieve screen-wide coverage. When linked to Arrow Nova support, this skill will be able to shoot out in all directions, leaving the entire screen covered in caustic ground. One thing that is special about this particular build is that with the Adorn unique jewel, this build can stack up some serious amount of life in its life pool, and that can go a long way in allowing a player to reach level 100. Now, for the main skill setup, you'll want a Toxic Rain linked to Efficacy, Empower, Awaken Vicious Projectiles, Awaken Void Manipulation, and Mirage Archer. A medium budget version of this setup would feature regular support gems instead of Awaken gems and a Cruelty support in place of the Empower. On a low budget 4-link setup, I would recommend linking Toxic Rain to Vicious Projectiles, Efficacy, and Mirage Archer. The reason we want to prioritize the Mirage Archer is because it increases the total amount of pods that you'll be able to spawn around enemies, thereby increasing overall single target damage. Now, for the Caustic Arrow setup, you'll want a Vol Caustic Arrow linked to Awakened Arrow Nova, Empower, Awaken Void Manipulation, Awaken Vicious Projectiles, and Awaken Swift Affliction. A medium budget version of this setup would feature regular support gems in place of the Awaken gems, and also Cruelty support in place of the Empower here as well. Keep in mind that Cruelty support might not be the most effective support, but is generally a convenient red socket placeholder before switching to Empower. On a low budget 4-link setup, I would recommend linking Caustic Arrow to Vicious Projectiles, Swift Affliction, and Arrow Nova. For the Aura Gem setup, this build reserves a Grace and Malevolence on its mana pool. Grace provides a large amount of evasion to the build, and Malevolence improves damage by scaling both damage over time multiplier as well as skill effect duration, which makes the pods from Toxic Rain and the Caustic Ground from Caustic Arrow last longer. Finally, this build has a Haste Aura linked to a Divine Blessing and an Inspiration support. If you don't have enough mana to cast the Haste Aura, running a level 1 Divine Blessing will reduce mana cost, and grabbing the mana efficiency nodes on the passive tree will also give you more mana to work with. For the utility gems, this build links a Toxic Rain of Withering to Mana Forge Arrows and Culling Strike to sustain Wither stacks on tanky enemies, as well as allow the build to execute bosses that have less than 10% life. Despair will further reduce the chaos resistance of cursed enemies, and a level 3 Immortal Call linked to cast when damage taken will serve as an additional layer of defense. The masteries that this build will want to grab in its endgame setup will include 20% increase AoE while wielding a bow, recover 4% life when you use a flask, prevent an additional 3% of suppressed spell damage, and plus 50 to maximum life. Now, for earlier progressions of this build, useful masteries to have early on will include plus 12% mana reservation efficiency, 8% increased damage per aura or herald affecting you, auras have 10% increase effect on you, and 15% spell suppression while your helmet, body armor, gloves, and boots have evasion rating. For the Ascendancy Passives, this build will grab the passives in the following order: Nature's Reprisal, Nature's Adrenaline, Master Surgeon, and finally, Nature's Boon. Eventually, once the build starts feeling tanky enough, you can drop Master Surgeon to allocate a point in a small Ascendancy node for more Flask effect later on. For the bow, you'll first want to start with a 4-link bow with high attack speed and any damage over time modifiers. Next, you'll want to upgrade to a cheap Corrupted 6-link bow, ideally with any damage over time modifiers on that as well. For the medium budget bow, you'll want to craft or purchase a plus 3 Thicket bow with attack speed and damage over time multiplier. Finally, the last upgrade you'll want once you have the endgame Quiver is a high-rolled Widowhail, which provides a massive multiplier to the modifiers on your Quiver. For the Quiver, you'll ideally want to start with a broadhead Quiver for some attack speed and use this item slot to fulfill any stat attribute requirements or elemental resistances early on. You'll eventually want to upgrade this item to something that has at least 2 damage modifiers on it, such as damage over time multiplier or increased damage with bow skills. Finally, a hunter influence Quiver with high life, multi, movement speed, and attack speed will serve as the basis for the endgame setup with Widowhail. With a 246% Widowhail, a Quiver like this will provide a total of 276 max life, 76% attack speed, 27% movement speed, and 152% damage over time multiplier. As you can see, there is incredible upside potential for running with a Widowhail setup. Now for the helmet, you'll likely start with one that fulfills life, stat attributes, and elemental resistances. You'll want to upgrade this to a helmet with similar stats but on a better item base, and with Eldritch Implicits that provide 6% physical damage shift and 20% reduced mana cost of attacks. Once you're able to fix your resistances with 100% uptime from Flasks, you'll want a helmet with high life, 2 high resistance modifiers, spell suppression, more physical damage shift, and +2 to socketed AoE. This will both increase the overlapping of pods shot by Toxic Rain, as well as the gem level of skills like Despair, which will be socketed in the helmet. Now for the body armor, early gearing options will include items like a Tabula Rasa, a 6-linked corrupted body armor, or anything with high life and elemental resistance. Once resistances are fixed by your Flask setup, you'll want to opt for a Lightning Coil, which greatly improves the build's physical max hit, and an endgame version will incorporate Vol implicits like +1 to socketed gems. For the gloves, you'll want to start with a pair that has high life and elemental resistances. You'll eventually want to upgrade this to a better item base and also roll Eldritch Implicits that provide chaos damage over time multiplier and spell suppression. Once you've capped your spell suppression, you can instead opt for Pierce on the implicits for more clear speed. The endgame version of this will look very similar to the helmet with high life and resistances, high suppression, +2 to AoE, and increased damage during Flask effect. Now for the boots, the main modifiers you'll want to prioritize early are movement speed and elemental resistances. An easy upgrade for this socket will be a pair of boots with high life, high movement speed, high resistances, and Eldritch Implicits that provide action speed and ailment avoidance. The final version of the boots will have a high chance to avoid shock, high spell suppression, high life, movement speed, and onslaught on kill. Now for the belt, this item slot will initially be used to fulfill stat attribute and elemental resistance requirements on a heavy belt. Eventually, you'll want to swap this to a Stygian Vise with life and resistance so that you could also socket an Abyss Jewel with life and phasing on kill. The final version of the belt will feature a hunter influenced Stygian Vise with high life, % life, increased Flask effect, and a 20% reduced Flask charges used. This reduced Flask charges used modifier will be crucial for the build to be able to sustain 100% Flask uptime. On the rings, these sockets will primarily be the place to fix stat attributes and resistance requirements while you're upgrading every other gear piece. I generally recommend to always have high stats or resistances here so that the other item slots remain flexible while upgrading your build. Once the other item pieces are fully upgraded and finally in place, the ideal modifiers you'll want on these rings will be high life, damage over time multiplier, increased chaos damage, and non-channeling skills have less mana cost. The Amulet is also another socket that remains fairly flexible in terms of modifiers you can roll. Useful modifiers early on will include things like life, resistances, stat attributes, and damage over time modifiers. However, to make this build truly invincible against small attacks, a Defiance of Destiny will eventually be used. This item allows you to regain missing life before every hit is calculated. Starting with a low roll Defiance of Destiny and gradually upgrading to higher rolls would be my recommended path of progression for this item slot. Now for the cluster jewels, these will be crucial for maximizing the build's clear speed, damage output, and access to jewel sockets, which will be important once you obtain the Adorned Jewel. This build will use 3 medium cluster jewels, each with Wicked Paw, Touch of Cruelty, and Unspeakable Gifts. Keep in mind that the build doesn't allocate Touch of Cruelty and that only Wicked Paw and Unspeakable Gifts should be used. These two notables will greatly increase the chaos damage dealt by the build, as well as allow for enemies to explode, dealing a quarter of their life as chaos damage. The explosions from Unspeakable Gifts is what will allow this build to achieve tremendous amounts of clear speed while mapping. Now for the medium cluster jewels, there will be 3 that have Shrieking Bolt and Repeater for increased projectile damage, and 1 cluster that has Peak Vigor and Spiked Concoction. Peak Vigor gives 8% max life, and Spiked Concoction will grant the build both attack speed and Alchemist Genius when a flask is used. The Alchemist Genius buff grants a total of 20% increased flask charges gained and 10% increased flask effect during its duration. This will be important for sustaining maximum flask uptime as well. Now for the jewels, common placeholders for jewel sockets will feature useful modifiers like % max life or damage over time multiplier. However, once an adorned jewel is obtained, you'll want to roll 8 corrupted magic jewels, each with 7% increased max life and 8% chaos damage over time multiplier. With a 129% adorned jewel, this will grant a total of 128% increased max life and 146% chaos dot multi from the magic jewels alone. In the final jewel socket near the herbalism passive, a lethal pride will be used to gain some much needed strength as well as another 10% physical damage from hits taken as fire damage. For the flask, it is important to run a ruby, topaz, and sapphire flask, which all have long durations that allow the build to sustain them permanently. By keeping 100% uptime on these flasks, the build is able to take advantage of the resistances granted by the flask and will have an easier time upgrading gear pieces. An important thing to note is that every magic flask will need the Flagellant's prefix modifier. This modifier allows the flask to gain 3 charges when hit by enemies, which fills the flask quickly when being hit by multiple mobs. A reduced mana cost suffix will also need to be crafted on one of these magic flasks in order to lower mana cost and allow the build to eventually drop mana reservation efficiency nodes from the passive tree. To finish things off, a Quicksilver flask and Progenesis will be the final flask in the build setup. Before upgrading to Progenesis, however, the build could run a Bleed Immunity Life flask while it still has Master Surgeon allocated. Okay, so for leveling progressions up to around level 70 to 75, which is when you can expect to be in maps, this is the general pathing that I would take. I'd first grab these attack speed nodes towards ballistics, then grab Aspect of the Eagle. Next, I would want to get Heart of Oak, Primal Spirit, and then go down to Finesse. I also like to grab Quick Step early just for a bit of extra movement speed, and then I would then path over here to the Avatar of the Hunt and grab all of these damage over time nodes, and then start pathing up towards Wasting. Next, I would then grab the Hunter's Gambit over here and grab the Area of Effect while wielding a bow, and then go over to Careful Conservationist and get the Flask Mastery where you can recover life when using a flask. Around this point, I would probably go for Charisma to fit my auras, and then after that I would path up to Blood Siphon, Trickery, Entropy, and Fangs of the Viper. After grabbing Fangs of the Viper, I would then path towards Growth and Decay for extra dot multi, grab Written in Blood for more life and ES, and then go over to Atrophy. And then once I grab Atrophy, I could then start looking to path around towards like any life nodes, like for example Herbalism. I probably want to grab Herbalism much earlier just for the plus 50 max life here. And then the other life nodes like Blood Drinker I could grab much later. And then from there I would want to start pathing downwards towards Natural Remedies, which gives us more flask duration. And then I would want to grab Thick Skin for elemental avoidance. Entrench and Inveterate will allow us to get a significant amount of spell suppression. And then as you can see, I'm roughly at level 80 by that point. And then you should be in maps by that point and grind out XP and currency to upgrade gear, and then start farming up regrets to pivot into the final tree. So yeah, let me know what other details you guys would like included in the leveling portion of the video. I don't usually add leveling progressions to my videos, but this is something new that I'm doing, and let me know in the comment section below how I can improve or include any other details that you guys might be interested in. And so that's all for this build guide. If you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comment section below, and if you want to support the channel, you can do so by hitting subscribe or consider joining the channel memberships. Thanks for watching the video, and I hope to see you all next time.